Well, it's my great honor to introduce our next speaker. If you don't know who Joseph Pearce is, I'm sort of wondering how you came to this conference. And of course, if you do know who Joseph Pearce is, I'm wondering why you came to the conference. I was telling Joseph that last night I got an email from Ignatius Press, and there was a PDF attached to it with a book that they are about to publish. And they asked if I would write one of the cover blurbs for the book. The book is by Joseph Pearce. But it was a book that he probably had written earlier in the day. And I replied, I said, well, I'm actually with Joseph Pearce this weekend, so why don't I just have him tell me what to say in the blurb, and then I don't have to bother reading the book. But it actually sounds like it's going to be a great book, and I actually am tempted to read it before I write the blurb. It's called Faith of Our Fathers, and it's the history of the Catholic Church in England, which goes back practically to the time of Christ. First century. There's evidence of Christianity in England. It's fascinating. Joseph said he actually worked on this book. So he's just such an accomplished writer and such a naturally great thinker, and he's done it all without the benefit of an education, which has screwed up the rest of us. And he's really just one of the marvels, and I am just so privileged to know him and count him as a friend. And please welcome the great Joseph Pearce, who's going to speak on poetry in its original Cockney.
So yes, there's going to be lots of poetry recitals in good Cockney. Okay, so get ready for it. As Dale set this up, I will actually begin with a short commercial break, because those of you that were at the last Chesterton conference in Rochester, which is 2 years ago now because of the COVIDious times in which we find ourselves, might have noticed there's been no new books from me since then. So I don't know what I've been doing. In fact, it takes me a couple of hours to write one because I have other things to do. But I do have 2 new books coming out, neither of which came out in time for this conference. But in November, Tan Books is publishing a book of mine which is entitled Benedict XVI, Defender of the Faith. And then in January, the Ignatius Press book, Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England. And that's the England that was true to the truth. And so the first Christian missionaries came to England in 63 AD, and it goes right through to the reconsecration of England to Our Lady of Walsingham during the COVID lockdown in 2021. So it goes right through the 20 centuries of English Catholic history. So bear those 2 books in mind. And the next thing I have to do, unfortunately, again because of COVIDious circumstances, Tan Books and St. Benedict Press's warehouse, they outsourced their distribution, has stopped functioning. And they're putting all right now, so within a week or so everything should be fine. But none of my books from Tan got here for that reason, including the book I'm going to be speaking on, Poems Every Catholic Should Know. So what they did do, however, is to design a flyer for me. So I printed out about 20 or 30 of them. So if you're interested in this book after the talk, then just help yourself to a flyer that's on my book table. Having said that, I'll actually get on with the talk. So Poems Every Catholic Should Know. What I'd like to do over the next 45 to 50 minutes is to give really a history of poetry. And recite some of my favourites along the way. I want to begin with, however, a definition, defining our terms, as what is poetry, because in our culture we've had, previous speakers talk about how poetry has been marginalised. It's no longer sort of part of the mainstream, something for the elites or the effetes, one or the other, or both. Whereas actual poetry comes from the Greek word poiesis, which just means to make. So in the deepest sense of the word, poetry is merely the creative outpouring of ultimately the divine. So God is the poet, creation is the poem, and we are poems within the poem. And part of the image of God in us is the fact we are made in his image, the imago Dei, the imagination. And one aspect of the divine in us is our ability to create, to make beautiful things as God makes beautiful things. So poetry is a way by which humanity expresses the divine image that's within itself. So that's poetry in the broadest sense of the word. We have to understand that the novel is a newfangled thing. Some people say it's Thomas Mallory, some people say it's Miguel de Cervantes, but the first novel, let's say it's Don Quixote, is actually dates from the latter half of Shakespeare's career, 1606. Prior to that, the novel was not part of the scene. All that there was prior to that was poetry and drama. And poetry takes two forms, narrative, and we'll be doing the Ballad of Reading Gaol. There's a Wildian slip for you. The Ballad of the White Horse later this afternoon. But you have narrative poetry, poetry that tells a story. So Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid by Virgil, Beowulf, Dante's Divine Comedy, narrative poetry. And then you have lyric poetry, poetry which is a song, which is a music for the lyre, L-Y-R-E. And so these two, and they both express aspects of the divine in man. The narrative is homo viator, man on a journey, pilgrim man, man who's going through life with the goal of heaven in mind, on a quest, facing dragons. That's who we are, homo viator, man in a story. So the narrative, whether it be a narrative verse or the novel, expresses that dimension of who we are. But the lyric, singing, is that other aspect, anthropos, he who looks up in wonder and sees the beauty of the cosmos and is moved to song by it. So for the most part, this is going to be about lyric poetry, because narrative poetry, obviously you can only take a snippet from it. With a lyric poem, you can read the whole thing if it's on the shorter side. So, having said that, my book's called Poems Every Catholic Should Know. It was originally, the original title of it, when it was published in the UK, at the end of the 20th century, with the millennium arriving, all of the secular media in the UK were talking about there's going to be one hell of a party. Right? It was all secular. As soon as the clock hits 2000, we're going to have a great drunken debauch. And there was no mention anywhere of the fact, well, what's the party for? Right? At the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus Christ. So I wanted to at least do something as my contribution to that birthday celebration. So I published an anthology of verse which was entitled Flowers of Heaven, 1000 Years of Christian Verse. That was his original title. The title Flowers of Heaven is a title of a poem by St. Robert Southwell, the Jesuit martyr. And then Tan, and it was a stroke of brilliance, repackaged it as Poems Every Catholic Should Know. And I've seen, by the fact I'm selling 10 copies of this book to every one I used to sell, that people, look at their face, they come up, they see it, and the first thing is, well, first a little bit of interest, then there's this feeling of guilt. You know, I'm a Catholic, and I haven't read any poetry. You know, and being realistic, you know, I'm not going to buy loads of volumes of poetry, but I'm going to buy one volume of poetry, assuage my conscience, be completely absolved of my sin of ignorance. So this book has been selling like hotcakes since they repackaged it. It's basically the same book. But of course, Poems Every Catholic Should Know, it's not every poem every Catholic should know. Not least because its original title was 1000 Years of Christian Verse. And there's some great verse great poetry that's written that's not overtly Christian. Shelley's To a Skylark, for instance, or we could go on. Loads of poems that we also should know. So it doesn't completely absolve you from sin, but it's a step in the right direction. But I'm going to use this as the basis of the talk. It's just good to have one book in front of me I can read from. So what I've done here is to arrange the verse chronologically. So it serves actually not just as an anthology of poetry, but also as a history of poetry. And whenever I come to a new poet, I give just a very short biographical introduction, which doesn't just introduce the person, but the time in which the person's living. So it contextualizes it. So it does work as a sort of a mini history of poetry as well. So I'm going to go through it chronologically and just pick out some highlights. So the first part of the book, it begins in the Middle Ages. And so the earliest poet we have, in fact the first three poets are all canonized saints. So first of all, St. Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century. And then St. Francis of Assisi, also 12th, 13th century. And St. Gertrude the Great, 13th century. So it begins with those. And then we have the great Dante. And I'm not going to read any of Dante for a couple of reasons. It's difficult, first of all, it's difficult to render the terza rima rhyme scheme of Dante, at least difficult for me to do it well. And the other thing is that in here, because most of the translations of Dante are still under copyright, and I had a limited budget, the selections we have of Dante in here is by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a good American poet, and I actually enjoy his poetic renditions of it, but they wouldn't necessarily be my favourite translation. But there was the quote, which I can't repeat, from the Italian, from this morning's talk, but it's translated here as, "Thou virgin mother, daughter of thy son." And that's from Paradise. And again, this encapsulation of the paradoxical nature of the Blessed Virgin. "Thou virgin mother, daughter of thy son." And then the next section is before Chaucer. So late medieval verse. And then we have Chaucer. And I just chose from Chaucer a couple of sections from the Prioress's Tale, but also the general prologue. And I do want to add something to the talk this morning, because what we have in the general prologue in The Poor Parson of a Town is one of the greatest depictions and descriptions of a saintly priest ever given. And it really puts the monk and the friar to even greater shame when they're stood side by side with this poor parson, who is the perfect priest. And then immediately after we have this description, we have his brother, the ploughman. And he only gets a few lines in the prologue, but he is clearly also a saint. And the fact that the Tolkien connects them as brothers, we have the saintly priest and the saintly layman side by side here in the middle of it. So it's this description of the poor parson of town which I've selected for this. And then we have the period after Chaucer until the storm, as I call it. And there's before the storm a couple of early 16th century verses. And then the storm, which is the rupture or the Reformation or whatever word you want to call it. And I choose two poems about connected to the great Marian shrine in England, Walsingham. And yesterday was the feast of Our Lady of Walsingham. Yay, indeed. And I have a great devotion to her, because I lived only 30 miles from the shrine of Walsingham my last years before entering the church, and I used to cycle out, and I've walked there as well from various parts of Norfolk to pay homage to her, and she basically held my hand and accompanied me across the threshold into the church. So I have a great love for her. So a little bit about the history of the apparition, and I'll tell you about these two poems, and I'm going to read the second of them. In 1061, the lady of the manor in a place called Little Walsingham in Norfolk received an apparition of the Blessed Virgin. in which it was requested that she build a replica of the house in which the Virgin lived as a child in Nazareth. And so she did that, and there's also stories about how miraculously it was done. But either way, first of all, Anglo-Saxon England went out in a blaze of supernatural glory, because while this apparition was happening, the Blessed Virgin appearing to Lady Richeldis, the King of England was St. Edward the Confessor. So we had a saint on the throne, and then this Marian apparition, and then we have the Norman Conquest, which obviously changes lots of things. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this. I'm going to take a very quick digression about 1066. This all connects, of course, with my recent book, History of England, History of Catholic England. But there's a wonderful story of Hilaire Belloc giving a lecture on 1066 in Oxford. And the Jesuit priest, Father Martin Darcy, is sitting next to J.R.R. Tolkien. At this time was not known. He was just a scholar. He wasn't known as writing Lord of the Rings or anything. But he was a premier Anglo-Saxon scholar. And as Belloc's giving his talk, which of course being Belloc, everything French is better than anything German. And therefore, as the Anglo-Saxons are Germans, therefore obviously the Normans are better than the Anglo-Saxons. And I'm simplifying it. But Belloc's thesis was basically 1066 was good for England because it brought England within the mainstream of Christendom. And as Belloc's giving this talk, Tolkien's getting angrier and angrier and angrier, shaking his head and mumbling under his breath. And Father Darcy said, why don't you, take issue with Belloc? Why don't you raise your hands? And Tolkien looked at Father Darcy as if his man said, you want me to challenge Belloc in public? But the point is, that the chapter, one of the chapters in Anglo-Saxon history in my book is called A Land of Saints. That the Anglo-Saxon England did not need the Norman Conquest to bring it into the mainstream of Christendom. It had been in the mainstream of Christendom for 500 years already. And in fact, the Catholic presence in England dates back to 63 AD, within 30 years of the crucifixion. It came over with the Romans. Okay, so this is the Marian Shrine to Our Lady of Walsingham became the premier Marian Shrine of Christendom. So the major shrines of pilgrimage, keeping on the theme we had from this morning, in medieval Europe, obviously Jerusalem, obviously Rome, Santiago de Compostela in Galicia in Spain, pilgrimage basically to St. James the Great. And then the two other major shrines at the time were both in England. Canterbury, which we've spoken about already, and Walsingham. Because it was the premier Marian shrine to the Blessed Virgin, and people came from all over Europe. It was called the Walsingham Way was known as the Milky Way, because there's a number of pilgrims on those various routes. And obviously the main one we think of these days is from London to Walsingham. It's about 100 miles. But actually, you look where Walsingham is on the map. If you don't know your England, if you can visualise a map of England and where London is on the map, then England is an eternally 9-month pregnant woman. So above London there's this big pregnant lump, right? That's the whole of Eastern England. That's called East Anglia. And the county at the top of that is Norfolk. And that's where Our Lady of Walsingham is. That's where I spent my last 13 years in England before moving here. So I'm in love with the area. But actually that was very accessible from Europe, because you just sail across the North Sea and you'd land. The nearest would be only about 15 miles from Walsingham. So this was a major Marian shrine. And so there's a poem here that I'm not going to read, called As Ye Came from the Holy Land, page 48. But this is basically a love poem, about a secular love poem. But the Holy Land here is the Holy Land of Walsingham, not the Holy Land of Palestine. So it just begins. As ye came from the Holy Land of Walsingham, met you not with my true love by the way as you came. So you have this image here of, the tens of thousands of people making the pilgrimage to Walsingham as they're making the pilgrimage to Canterbury also. But then I want to read this poem that in here is called The Lament for Walsingham. There's not a set title for it. I usually call it The Ballad of Walsingham. And it's allegedly written by a martyr. God help me. Actually, I'll tell you what, Sheet, Pearce, you've written it in here. I think I said it here. So allegedly written by St. Philip Howard, one of the English martyrs. But this is written in the 1500s, but probably about 50 years after the destruction of the shrine by Henry VIII in 1538. So it's around the time of Shakespeare, or early Shakespeare. It's probably written by a convert to the faith who becomes a Jesuit and is eventually martyred. But what he's describing here is this shrine that had been the centre of major pilgrimages with a huge priory, all sorts of other churches and friaries, and the shrine itself on the site of where the replica of Nazareth was built. Bitter, oh, to behold the grass to grow where the walls of Walsingham so stately did show. Such were the worth of Walsingham while she did stand. Such are the racks as now do show of that so holy land. Level with the ground the towers do lie, which with their golden glittering tops pierced out to the sky. Where were gates, no gates are now, the ways unknown, where the press of friars did pass, while far her fame was blown. Owls do strike, where the sweetest hymns lately were sung. Toads and serpents hold their dens, where the palmers did throng. Weep, O Walsingham, whose days are nights, blessings turn to blasphemies, holy deeds to despites. Sin is where Our Lady sat, heaven turned to hell. Satan sits where our Lord did sway. Walsingham, oh farewell. Breaks your heart. And then next in the book is the section on St. Robert Southwell, or St. Robert Southwell, however you prefer. Another Jesuit martyr, another convert to the faith. Great influence on William Shakespeare. This is really bad salesmanship, because I'm now going to plug a book of mine you can't buy out there if you want to, because I haven't got any copies with me. But in my book Shakespeare and Love, which is a study of Romeo and Juliet, there's an appendix called The Jesuit Connection, and I go into this at much greater depth than I'm able to do now. But I want to concentrate just on two poems by St. Robert Southwell. There's a selection of about 8 or 9 in here. The one I'm going to resist reading, but I love, this is just an extract from it, called From of the Blessed Sacrament of the Altar. What Southwell was doing is what John Henry Newman would do, the other saint 250 years later. As a priest, he's instructing people, including non-Catholics, about aspects of doctrine which they no longer believe. So when we get to Newman, we'll see the example of that. This is obviously St. Robert Southwell waxing not just lyrical but theological on the Blessed Sacrament of the Altar, and it's beautiful. The poem Seek Flowers of Heaven, which gave the title of this volume, its titles here as well. But anyway, what I want to do is read just 2 poems. Upon the Image of Death was a very interesting literary exercise for those of you who want to dig deeper. This poem by Sir Robert Southwell was hugely influential on Shakespeare's graveyard scene in Hamlet. You know the famous scene, alas poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. You actually read that beside this, and you can see that basically Shakespeare is giving a deferential nod to Sir Robert Southwell, whom he almost certainly knew, and probably well. So, upon the image of death by Sir Robert Southwell. Before my face the picture hangs that daily should put me in mind of those cold qualms and bitter pangs that shortly I am like to find. But yet, alas, for little I do think hereon that I must die. I often look upon a face, most ugly, grisly, bare and thin. I often view the hollow place where eyes and nose had sometimes been. I see the bones across that lie, yet little think that I must die. I read the label underneath that telleth me whereto I must. I see the sentence eke that saith, remember, man, that thou art dust. But yet, alas, but seldom I do think indeed that I must die. Continually at my bed's head a hearse doth hang, which doth me tell that I ere morning may be dead, though now I feel myself full well. But yet, alas, for all this I have little mind that I must die. The gown which I do used to wear, the knife wherewith I cut my meat, and eke that old and ancient chair, which is my only usual seat, all those do tell me I must die, and yet my life amend not I. My ancestors are turned to clay, and many of my mates are gone. My youngers daily drop away, and can I think to scape alone? No, no, I know that I must die, and yet my life amend not I. Not Solomon for all his wit, nor Samson though he were so strong, no king nor person ever yet could scape, but death laid him along. Wherefore I know that I must die, and yet my life amend not I. Though all the east did quake to hear of Alexander's dreadful name, and all the west did likewise fear to hear of Julius Caesar's fame, yet both by death in dust now lie. Who then can scape, but he must die? If none can scape death's dreadful dart, if rich and poor his beck obey, if strong, if wise, if all do smart, then I to scape shall have no way. O grant me grace, O God, that I my life may mend, since I must die. Another poem, this is the Assumption of Our Lady. So again we see St. Robert Southwell defending Catholic doctrine against attacks upon it in the wake of the Reformation. But now the next one I want to read is Deceased Release, and the reason I love this for various reasons. It's a poem written by St. Robert Southwell. It's in the first person. It's in the voice of Mary Queen of Scots, and it's in her voice the eve of her execution, which is going to be beheaded. So what's creepy about this poem, in a very good sense, is yes, we can visualize these being Mary Queen of Scots' words and thoughts and prayers the eve of her execution, but also we know that St. Robert Southwell himself is going to be tortured for 2 years and then put to a hideously slow death by hanging, drawing and quartering. So what makes it creepy is we're reading this, the I is the future martyr as well as the queen who'd already been put to death. And the other glorious thing about this is a happy memory for me. Most of my knowledge, like most of us, comes from secondary sources. We read them from somewhere else and maybe check them out. But I was in Rome a few years ago, alone in Rome, in an Italian restaurant, and just had a really wonderful Italian meal. And of course, one thing you have to have with a really wonderful Italian meal is really wonderful Italian wine. And I'd had my 2 courses, and I still had a half bottle of wine left, and it would of course be sacrilegious to leave it there. So I thought, well, I'm in no hurry. So I thought I'm going to spend another hour or so at the table here, finishing the wine, and I'll read the book I brought with me, which was the collected poems of Sir Robert Southwell. And I knew quite a few of his poems, but I didn't know this poem, Deceased Release. And there's a line in it where he talks about Mary Queen of Scots being God's spice. That the martyr is someone who's crushed to death, but in the crushing, the fragrance rises to heaven like incense or just beautiful smelling spices. And I thought, God's spice. Wow, one of my favourite speeches in all of Shakespeare is the "Come, let's away to prison" speech by King Lear at the end, where he basically said, let's embrace martyrdom. And he says, and we can be as God's spies. Now we know Shakespeare loves puns, and the Jesuits were known as God's spies, because it was punishable by death to be a Jesuit priest in England. So the Jesuits in England were by day, their day job was as a gardener or a school teacher, but they were also living double lives as Catholic priests. They were God's spies. But then when they were caught, they became God's spice. And this connection between this poem of Sir Robert Southwell's and that speech in King Lear, and then that other connection between Sir Robert Southwell the martyr and Mary Queen of Scots the martyr, is what I put before you as we read this. Deceased Release by Sir Robert Southwell. The pounded spice, both taste and scent, doth please. In fading smoke the force doth incense show. The perished kernel springeth with increase. The lopped tree doth best and soonest grow. God's spice I was, and pounding was my due. In fading breath my incense favoured best. Death was my means my kernel to renew. By lopping shot I up to heavenly rest. Some things more perfect are in their decay, like spark that going out gives clearest light. Such was my hap, whose doleful dying day began my joy and termed fortune's spite. Alive a queen, now dead I am a saint. Once Mary called, my name now martyr is. From earthly reign debarred by restraint, in lieu whereof I reign in heavenly bliss. My life, my grief, my death hath wrought my joy. My friends, my foil, my foes, my weal procured. My speedy death have scorned long annoy, and loss of life on endless life assured. My scaffold was the bed where ease I found, the block a pillow of eternal rest. My headman cast me in blissful sound, his axe cut off my cares from cumbered breast. Rue not my death, rejoice at my repose. It was no death to me, but to my woe. The bud was open to let out the rose, the chains unloosed to let the captive go. A prince by birth, a prisoner by mishap, from crown to cross, from throne to fall I fell. My right, my ruth, my titles wrought my trap, my weal, my woe, my worldly heaven, my hell. By death from prisoner to a prince enhanced, from cross to crown, from fall to throne again. My ruth, my right, my trap, my still advanced, from woe to weal, from hell to heavenly reign. So Sir Robert Southwell, great poet, great influence on Sir William Shakespeare, and a great martyr and saint of the church. I'm going to move on very briefly without reading any more of his poetry to Richard Crashaw. So the metaphysical poets, probably the best known are John Donne and George Herbert, but Robert Southwell was absolutely a metaphysical poet and predates those Herbert and Donne. But, where are we? So I'm looking for it here. Here we go. So Richard Crashaw actually was the son of a Puritan minister who ranted against the theatre and against popery in general, but wanted the theatre closed down. And that's William Crashaw, who was a Puritan minister. His son, Richard Crashaw, becomes a Catholic, and in consequence is forced into exile and poverty. He spends some time in Paris in poverty, and ends up in Rome, and finally at Loreto, where he dies, only as 35, 36 years old. And he's some wonderful poetry, particularly, by the way, his two best poems are actually inspired by St. Teresa of Avila. So here we see the Catholic Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation bearing great poetic fruit. But actually, what I love, he also wrote a lot of poems in Latin, and there's just a little epigram. He wrote a book called my Latin's bad, Epigrammatum Sacrorum Liber, basically a collection of Latin epigrams that he wrote. And this is one about the miracle of Cana. The miracle of Cana, which you also know, water into wine, etc. And Nympha pudica Deum vidit et ruberit, which translates as the modest water saw its God and blushed, which is absolutely beautiful. And now we're going to move on to, moving on in time here to make sure that we have time, to the Romantic poets, so writing at the end of the 18th, early 19th century. And we don't have many in here, but one by William Blake, which I want to talk about. It's again connected to Catholic history. Those of you that know your music will know that I think it's Sir William Parry set Jerusalem to music, and it's sort of become the unofficial English national anthem. I mean, God Save the Queen is sort of British, right? And the Scots have Flower of Scotland, and the Welsh have Land of Our Fathers, but the English, didn't have their own national anthem. Well, this sort of become the de facto unofficial English national anthem. You see, if England playing rugby fans are more cultured than soccer fans. It's said, I think, quite truly that rugby is a game for barbarians played by gentlemen. Soccer is a game for gentlemen played by barbarians. But I think this plays itself out in the sense that at rugby games, if England are playing rugby, you will hear the crowd singing this song. Not at soccer games, it's a bit too refined. I'm not going to sing it, you'll be very pleased to know. But it was originally written before it's set to music anyway as a poem by William Blake. It's called Jerusalem. And I just want as a background influence on this dates back to a pious legend. And there's two pious legends about England connected to St. Joseph of Arimathea. The more prosaic and more possible, but admittedly and confessedly unlikely, is that in 63 AD, which is the date when the first disciples are said to have arrived in England, that's an absolutely fair date because we know that by the 3rd century, the shrine to Our Lady, the chapel to Our Lady in Glastonbury in Somerset was already known as an ancient shrine by the 3rd century. So the fact that the first chapel to the Blessed Virgin was established in Glastonbury in the 1st century is not really beyond, it's not really open to question. So 63 AD is reasonable. But what's probably less reasonable is that group of disciples was led by St. Joseph of Arimathea, which might just be wishful thinking. But even more wishful thinking, which I nonetheless love, and is the background to this poem, that was that when Jesus was a child, St. Joseph of Arimathea took him on holiday. to England. And the sort of context is, obviously St. Joseph of Arimathea is wealthy, therefore he's a tradesman. And it is true that there was a lot of trade between the Middle East and southwest England, where there were a lot of tin mines. So there was trade going on. So it's not completely bizarre, but it is wishful thinking. So the English, the Catholic English, quite charmingly like the idea that the Christ child, during all those years, we don't know what happened to Jesus. There's one incident when he's 13, right? But from that time, until he begins his ministry, we don't know what he was doing. So why can't he come on vacation to England? Seems reasonable to me. But that's the background to this. So with that in your mind, you will really get the romance of this desire for England to be a true child of the church again. Jerusalem by William Blake. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here, among these dark satanic mills? Bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear, O clouds unfold. Bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental strife, so mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. What a worthy national anthem that is. And another one, I don't have time to read it. By the way, just tell me, I've lost track of time. Am I supposed to be going on to
4:30.
Sorry? 4:30, yeah, thank you. Is it 12:15? What, is that say 10 past 12? We're in the afternoon, aren't we? What time am I supposed to finish? Someone speak English to me. What does the programme say?
You should have been done in half an hour.
Thank you, John. And now feel at home. John Fanukins insulted me. It's, everything's good and traditional. It's good. 5 or 10 minutes now. Oh yeah. No, I'll finish in 5 or 10 minutes. We'll just leave Chesterton out. Nobody wants to listen to him anyway. So there's a poem in here I would like you to read for homework. It's your reading assignment, called Hymn Before Sunrise in the Vale of Chamonix by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's just a beautiful poem about how the beauty of a sunrise in the Alps is like a prayer to God, a hymn of praise to God, where all of nature is calling us to join in. Jeremiah Hopkins, I'm going to pass over Jeremiah Hopkins, which is a sin. It's a mortal sin, calling out to heaven for vengeance. And Newman, because I think we do need to get to Belloc and Chesterton. So Oscar Wilde, you've heard me, I know at these conferences, if you were listening, refer to some of my favourite lines from Oscar Wilde from the Ballad of Reading Gaol. But God's eternal laws are kind and break the heart of stone, for how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in. Ernest Dowson, another great decadent poet, that goes well together, doesn't it? You've got to like that. He again lived a dissolute life, big drink problem, died young from basically abusing his body. But there's two wonderful poems in here. One's called Nuns of the Perpetual Adoration, where he's looking at the peace to be found before the Blessed Sacrament. Another one called Extreme Unction, the peace to be found at death through the administering of the last rites of the Church. But I'm going to go on to Belloc. Recently in the Inner Sanctum on my website, we've read The Whole of the Path to Rome. And it finishes with this wonderful poem, which recounts what Belloc had done, and that's a pilgrimage that, that Belloc did, the pilgrimage theme, all the way from northern France through Switzerland, over the Alps, down through Italy to Rome, arriving in time for the feast of St. Peter and Paul, and to hear Mass there. So this wonderful poem about pilgrimage, and then we'll move on to Chesterton. The End of the Road by Hilaire Belloc. In these boots and with this staff, 200 leaguers and a half, walked I, went I, paced I, tripped I, marched I, held I, skelped I, slipped I, pushed I, panted, swung and dashed I, picked I, forded, swam and splashed I, strolled I, climbed I, crawled and scrambled, dropped and dipped I, ranged and rambled, plodded I, hobbled I, trudged and tramped I, and in lonely spinneys camped I, and in haunted pine woods slept I, lingered, loitered, limped and crept I, clambered, halted, stepped, and leapt I, slowly sauntered, roundly strode I, and, O patron saints and angels that protect the four evangels, and you prophets vel majoris, vel incerte vel minores, virgines ac confessores, chief of whose peculiar glories est in aula regis stare, atque orare et exorare, et clamare et conclamare, clamantis cum clamoribus, pro nobis peccatoribus. Let me not conceal it, rode I. For who but critics could complain of riding in a railway train, across the valleys and the highland, with all the world on either hand, drinking when I had a mind to, singing when I felt inclined to, nor ever turned my face to home, till I had slaked my heart at Rome. That's absolutely glorious. And there's a poem here called Twelfth Night as well, which I would read if we had time. You have to buy the book. Where he basically talks about coming across this ghostly company singing, Glorious in Excelsis Domine on Twelfth Night, and he's in the woods and he's by himself, and they're like a company of elves, and he's scared, so he hides away, and he just ends. He saw a light in the distance, an elven light in the distance. He said, "Perhaps if I had travelled with them, I might have come to Bethlehem." All right, I'm going to finish with just two poems by Chesterton. And again, my favourite poems by Chesterton aren't in here. My favourite poem by Chesterton of all, I think, is the Strange Music, which he wrote for his wife, which is just glorious. And Lepanto, of course, which you've all heard. And we're going to be doing parts of the Battle of the White Horse soon. But I've only got three here. A hymn, A God of Earth and Altar, which we've sung at the Traveller's Mass in past years here. But the other two I have is the Skeleton and the Donkey, which just shows Chesterton's paradoxical understanding of the first shall be last and last shall be first, and the humour of God, the glory of the grotesque, etc. I love it. His other one, The Fish, where he talks about the fish being in the abyss untrod. Think about that as a description of water, the abyss untrod, unless you're Jesus Christ. The Skeleton by G.K. Chesterton. Chattering finch and waterfly are not merrier than I. Here among the flowers I lie, laughing everlastingly. No, I may not tell the best, surely, friends, I might have guessed. Death was but the good king's jest. It was hid so carefully. So the humour of God, I think he said the orthodoxy, where he finishes with the one aspect of Christ he does not reveal to us is his mirth. And then similar theme, The Donkey by G.K. Chesterton. When fishes flew and forests walked and figs grew upon thorn, Some moment when the moon was blood, then surely I was born. With monstrous head and sickening cry, and ears like errant wings, the devil's walking parody on all four-footed things. The tattered outlaw of the earth, of ancient crooked will. Starve, scourge, deride me, I am dumb. I keep my secret still. Fools, for I also had my hour, one far fierce hour and sweet. There was a shout about my ears and palms before my feet. Thank you very much.